Chapter 8 The Future History of Electricity. Fresh water in the desert, May 25, 2050. San Pedro de Atacama, Chile. A water fountain sits in the middle of the Atacama Desert, a desolate 600-mile-long stretch along the coast of Chile. It has no pipes connecting it to a water source. The nearest power outlet isn't anywhere in sight. Yet the water fountain reliably produces purified water for anyone who wants a drink, day after day, week after week. How is this possible? Some explanation may be in order. The Atacama Desert is the driest place on Earth outside of the polar deserts. It averages 0.6 inches of rainfall annually, and some weather stations here have never registered a drop of rain. But the humidity is some 30%. That means there's a lot of water available in the air for anyone with a condenser and enough power to drive it. That's why, 33 years ago, in 2017, Chilean engineer Héctor Pino and two colleagues at Freshwater, a Chilean startup, chose the middle of the Atacama Desert to dramatize their development of a freestanding water fountain. The device ran on standard alternating current, on batteries, or on solar power, and the Atacama Desert, it won't surprise you to hear, has plenty of sun. Pino and his colleagues proclaimed that anyone setting up enough of their freshwater devices and solar panels could have as much clean water as they wanted, anywhere they wanted it, without any connection to water pipes or electric grids. And they proved their point. Circa 2020, about 40,000 Chilean communities, mostly in rural areas, had little or no access to surface or groundwater supplies and had to rely on transported water. Throughout Latin America, Pino estimated 34 million people were living in the same situation. The World Health Organization, WHO, said that globally, 500 million lacked sufficient water all year long, and that 4 billion people spent at least 1 month a year without enough water. We wanted to democratize access to this vital resource, Pino explained. Earth's atmosphere contains 13 trillion tons of water in the form of clouds, fog, and water vapor, which is 6 times as much water as in the world's rivers. And unlike rivers, the atmospheric moisture is everywhere, even in the Atacama Desert. Freshwater's device was initially expensive, some $1,600 in 2020, and only produced 9 liters of water a day. The WHO says a person needs 50 liters a day to meet basic needs for drinking, food preparation, personal hygiene, and sanitation. For good measure, the company ran into political and competitive obstacles. It turned out the companies that truck water to remote areas in Chile didn't exactly welcome the potential competition, and they held sway at various levels of government. Freshwater found its prospects limited. Then the laws of zero kicked in. Advances in computing and information drove the development of materials and designs to allow the company to more effectively and efficiently extract moisture. Some scientists, for example, took inspiration from plant structures, such as the fog-collecting needles of giant sequoia trees, to improve the surface structure design of collectors. Others, such as Professor Omar Yagi at the University of California, Berkeley, developed much better water-absorbing materials. Advances in 3D printing allowed manufacturing to happen much closer to where the devices were needed and allowed for any replacement parts to be produced more quickly and cheaply. Increasingly advanced sensors alerted users when a device was about to fail, essentially eliminating downtime, and warned if water had been sitting so long in the device's reservoir that it had become fetid. And, of course, the law of zero for energy kept driving down the cost for the solar capabilities that power these devices and make it easy for them to operate off the grid. The economics of water-from-air solutions overwhelmed all obstacles. It's now the de facto approach for bringing water to the thirstiest parts of the world, providing a wild boost to productivity. The old saying is that plumbers have saved more lives than doctors, and freshwater became the plumber for developing countries. In the 1920s and 1930s, Nikola Tesla worked on a plan to harness cosmic energy and broadcast electricity to everyone in the world without a need for wires. While the brilliant Serbian-American accomplished so many other things, including our system of alternating current and much of the early work on radio transmission, he never did manage to build what he called his world power system. But today, in 2050, electricity is so cheap and widely available off the grid that even pulling water from the air is as natural as breathing in oxygen in many parts of the world. Why, you could now have an orange grove in the middle of the Atacama Desert if you wanted, perhaps to sell juice at the ice cream bar you're going to set up, using the abundant solar power at your fingertips to refrigerate the Ben & Jerry's Chunky Monkey you've had flown into you by solar-powered drones. That's how the future history of electricity could look by 2050. Now, let's explore how to invent that future. The idea of water anywhere and all the drops to drink, or to use however you want, is actually just the start of what the law of zero on energy delivers. We think it'd be crazy not to have clean electricity available to everyone, everywhere, in abundant and affordable quantities in the future perfect. Without breakthroughs, inertia will carry us to a future where we still rely heavily on fossil fuels, and where many parts of the world have no or limited access to electricity, whether that's because costs are too high or because the grid doesn't reach them. But the exponentials in the law of zero can deliver vast increases in carbon-free, renewable energy sources, together with either extensive batteries or nuclear energy that can fill the gaps the renewable sources can leave. The laws of zero will also allow more and more communities to cut loose from the grid and will extend access to power to parts of the world that currently aren't served. Life doesn't exist without energy. With unlimited energy, free from the constraints that the dangers of greenhouse gases place on today's sources, life can be lush everywhere. The law of zero on energy will be the second coming of Prometheus, but no one will have to bear being chained to a rock and having his liver eaten and regrown every day as punishment from the heavens for this great gift to the human race. Our goal is certainly formidable. Projections are that the world will need twice as much electricity in 2050 as is produced now. Even if the planet's population somehow doesn't increase, and even if energy efficiency improves massively, having billions of people climb out of poverty and into a middle-class existence means they'll consume far more electricity than they do now. And even in most developed economies, clean energy still provides just a modest amount of the power. In the U.S., renewables supply only about 14% of the electricity. Do the math. A doubling of electricity consumption, while going from 14 to 100% reliance on clean sources, would mean we'd need about 14 times as much renewable energy in 2050 as what exists today. It's not easy, but it's doable. We've already explained how solar will have the potential to be everywhere and low cost. It won't just be arranged as massive power plants or even as panels on your roof, but as shingles on your roof, in your windows, even in the paint on your house or apartment building. You'll even get solar power at night, drawing on changes in temperature. Wind power will be widespread too, and, like solar, will be extremely inexpensive. Some countries, such as Denmark, which has access to the high winds on the North Sea, already get as much as half their electricity from wind and benefit from its zero marginal cost. Texas, while known as the home of oil and gas in the U.S., is also the state producing the most wind energy. The winds blow hard across West Texas. Wind power, which is strongest at night, complements solar power, and together they're expanding so quickly in Texas that they're expected to provide 59,000 megawatts of electricity by 2023. That would be enough to power nearly 12 million homes in Texas, which has just 7.4 million households, meaning there'll be plenty of electricity left over for use by businesses or for export. Texas black gold is turning green. Yes, we all saw what happened in February 2021, when 10 days of cold weather caused a catastrophic loss of electricity in Texas. Many wind turbines iced up, and some Texas government officials, along with other critics of renewable energy, seized on the problem to argue that wind was too unreliable a source to play much of a role in the grid of the future. But the deep freeze hardly obviates a role for wind. Wind turbines work just fine in winter weather, far harsher than Texas experienced. The issue in Texas is that officials didn't prepare for cold weather in the way that those operating in, say, Alaska and North Dakota do. The real issues, as the Texas crisis dramatized, are that we need to prepare better for extreme weather, which will happen more and more often, and that we need to modernize the grid. Texas operates almost entirely free of the rest of the national grid to avoid federal regulation, so only pockets of territory within the state's borders could draw on power from other states. Critics of renewables are certainly correct in saying the sun isn't always shining and the wind isn't always blowing where you need electricity. But that doesn't mean there isn't plenty of shining and blowing somewhere within reach of a transmission line. You obviously don't have to have an oil well and refinery next to your garage to fill your car with gasoline. A massive global system will ship it to you based on fracking in Pennsylvania or pumping in Saudi Arabia. And massive investments going into making transmission more efficient mean it'll be possible to deliver renewable power over great distances. Sunny North Africa, for instance, is exploring the possibility of powering cloudy northern Europe. China is building an ultra-high-voltage supergrid to carry electricity from the massive wind and solar farms in its rural northwest regions to its megacities in the east and south. Last year, China brought a 2,046-mile-long transmission line online. Storage capability is moving the slowest of all the major factors in the law of zero on energy, but the magic of the markets should speed things up nicely. If you think about it, Tesla is basically a bet on a rapid improvement in batteries. Tesla needs the best batteries in its cars because range is key in the competition among electric vehicles. So Elon Musk is investing in the area as fast as he can, including by building multi-billion-dollar plants to generate economies of scale. Tesla's purchase of Solar City also depends on improving in-home batteries to the point that they, in combination with the batteries in Tesla cars, can capture all the power generated by solar panels and produce a system that powers both the home and the car. The stock market is giving Musk all sorts of encouragement. As of this writing, Tesla is valued at $655 billion, more than all the other car companies in the world, even though the company commands just 1.6% share of the auto market in the U.S. So Musk has access to all the capital he needs, and then some. Markets aren't always trustworthy. In fact, they remind us of the famous line about the once closely watched index of leading economic indicators, the federal government measure that was said to have predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. But markets don't have to be trustworthy, at least for our purposes. While markets are providing all sorts of capital for Musk to drive innovation in batteries, they're also creating loads of incentives for others to emulate him, and will provide tons of capital, whether wise or wasted, that will help others drive innovation in batteries and in a host of other areas that touch on our future perfect. Basically, markets guess at what the future might be and then pull the benefits forward to today in the form of market value for those who are fortunate enough to make a compelling case about owning that future. We all benefit as a society from the resultant innovations, whether or not the investors do. Global superpower competition will accelerate innovation in batteries, too. Other than the fight currently raging over which country will dominate 5G wireless technology, it's hard to imagine a more intense battle than the one over who will own the battery space. China, in particular, sees batteries as a route toward economic advantage, but the US and Europe won't give up without a fight. There are concerns about the footprint that solar and wind power may require, particularly in a world where increasing food needs may claim dibs on usable land. But there are also alternatives for clean, inexpensive, ubiquitous electricity. Increasingly, many lean toward nuclear power, which provides so much more electricity for any given footprint. Supporters will have to overcome the continuing worries about radiation leaks and disposal of nuclear waste, but a host of small, modular designs for reactors show promise. So do new fuels, such as thorium, which costs much less than uranium, generates far less waste, and presents many fewer risks of a radioactive leak. Hydroelectric power, long the biggest provider of clean energy, will fade in importance, but will likely remain a significant part of the renewable energy mix in 2050. Some utilities are even setting up solar farms that float on the water in the reservoirs. All that surface area is available, so why not use it? There are even synergies. Covering the water with panels reduces evaporation, and the water cools the solar panels, which makes them more efficient. Geothermal shows promise too, at least in certain areas. Geothermal, which involves drilling deep into the Earth's crust to tap into pockets of heat that can then be turned into electricity, is of interest to the oil and gas industry. As fossil fuels fade in importance, the industry will be able to leverage its expertise and technology for such deep heat wells. Bob Metcalfe, who showed up as an early hero in our narrative as the inventor of the Ethernet at Xerox PARC and as the eponym of the law on network effects, is leading a major effort at the University of Texas to innovate on geothermal. So, free-ish sources of electricity will be abundant in the future perfect, even if we just maintain our current trajectory, and we'll be able to use the energy sources of 2050 to their absolute capacity without fear of generating greenhouse gases. There are already so many sources and so many developing that you can assume, with great confidence, that energy simply doesn't have to be a constraint by 2050. We as a society must face the issue of the loss of jobs in fossil fuels, which won't just hurt individuals, but also whole communities and even regions. These effects are real concerns, but from the viewpoint of 30 years from now, the math is overwhelming. The price for building new solar and wind power will soon be lower than the cost just for the fuel in oil and gas plants in many areas, and the disparity will only grow as we approach 2050. So, all the growth will be in renewables. The International Renewable Energy Agency acknowledges that 7.4 million jobs in fossil fuels will likely be lost by 2050 worldwide, but contends that 19 million jobs will be created in renewable energy, energy efficiency and grid enhancements, and energy flexibility, for a gain of 11.6 million jobs. We need to enable those new jobs while doing everything possible to help today's workers, businesses, communities, and regions fit into that future. The everywhere part of our what would it be crazy not to have in the future perfect will be trickier, but not by a lot. First, even though many sources of power will still run through the grid, solar can be anywhere. No grid required. Second, even with non-solar sources, Batteries will give you much more flexibility in how much you'll have to rely on the grid. For instance, there'll be a huge number of community-sized microgrids that might not even connect to the central grid, instead drawing on some local source of solar, wind, etc. The key here will be having a massive battery at the heart of the microgrid to keep everything running smoothly, whatever form that battery takes, assuming technology delivers the hoped-for breakthrough. These microgrids could be communities that basically declare their independence from the existing grid structure, or could be any sort of new community, a neighborhood, a factory, an office, or an apartment building, whatever. Homes could even leave the grid one at a time. They too will have exceptional battery capacity to store electricity from solar or any other source. They'll also have access to electric cars that will provide a buffer. You can use solar, say, to charge the car battery during the day, and then have it power the house through the night. Ford recently announced an electric version of its popular F-150 pickup that would provide exactly that sort of backup for days. So, yes, you can count on clean, affordable electricity for everyone, everywhere, in the future perfect. The benefits will be enormous. For one thing, blackouts will almost entirely go away. If the grid goes down in a storm, the battery in your home or at the center of your microgrid should take less than a second to kick in. Grid-scale batteries will engage nearly as fast, even for those who don't have a local battery backup. The grid will be far more wired than it is today, so it can sense and respond to problems instantly. As hard as it may be to believe, at the moment, a utility generally learns about outages when customers call to complain. Managers map where the calls are coming from, guess where a line is down, and send a crew out to inspect it visually. Blackouts cause around $150 billion of damage, including lost economic activity, just in the U.S. each year. And the deep freeze in Texas will obviously make the figure for 2021 far higher. Now think about all the other countries where electricity is far less reliable, and imagine the benefits that will come just from almost eliminating blackouts. Health will also improve, especially in developing countries, where access to abundant, clean electricity will let people stop burning wood, peat, cow dung, and kerosene, which is much cleaner than the others, but is still quite bad. These fuels not only pollute the air, but cause so many health problems for the folks who cluster around the fires for heat or to cook over, day in and day out, year in and year out. Cutting way back on those fuels will, in turn, largely end the deforestation that results from the wood burning in developing countries. When one of your authors visited Ethiopia in 1991, the magnificent forests in the highlands, fabled through the centuries, had been cut down for firewood and were almost wiped out. The denuded land had then seen vast amounts of topsoil washed down into the Nile by the summer monsoons. The problems have only worsened in the decades since. Trees don't grow overnight, and that topsoil will never flow back up the Nile. So the area will recover slowly, but it'll at least have some breathing room. The thousands of similarly deforested areas around the world will, too. A major cause of wildfires, which pose such a threat these days in much of the world, will largely disappear. Utilities spark many of the fires because long-distance, high-voltage lines arc in dry areas. But batteries in the home and in microgrids will take much of the load off those dangerous trunk lines, and thus reduce sparks from arcing. Climate change will increase the danger of wildfires in other ways, so we're not saying the risk will go away, but one of today's main drivers will. The sensors made possible by the law of zero on information will also let authorities learn of problems much sooner, likely, we hope, before they rage out of control. Health problems associated with what's known as environmental racism will greatly diminish, too. Utilities tend not to build coal and gas-fired power plants in wealthy areas, So, plants, which are still often built reasonably close to cities to reduce the distance for transmitting electricity, are generally built in poorer areas. That means the emissions disproportionately hurt BIPOC communities. Now, that pollution will go away. For good measure, while manufacturing facilities may still create pollution, the law of zero for transportation will make it easier for workers to live wherever they want, perhaps in cities, perhaps in rural areas far away. The key issue is what to do about the grid. We already know we need to modernize it to increase reliability and ensure that, for instance, Texas has access to power in other states the next time weather takes down its grid. The bad news is that estimates for the cost of modernizing the grid, just in the U.S., range as high as $5 trillion. The good news is that utilities are already projected to spend $1.5 to $2 trillion by 2030 to maintain reliability of the nation's electricity supply, so loads of money is already being allocated to the issue. The question for the future will be how to best direct those funds. This is where future histories and the idea of living in the future can help. Utilities and their regulators, buttressed by research in national labs, can imagine idealized futures now and can start to build versions of them. These prototypes will be far more expensive now than they would be in 2050, because the technologies aren't ripe yet. But the experiments don't have to be that large and will do a lot to guide the expenditure of trillions of dollars. We're intrigued by the potential of microgrids, about how reliable they'd be on their own, and about how they'd integrate, if at all, with the existing grid. If things go well, this is how the world might look in 2050. Africa rises out of energy poverty. Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, February 14, 2050. Beniam Tesfaye, a 45-year-old high school literature teacher, returned to his apartment in a town on the edge of this sprawling metropolis of nearly 5 million people after a long day with his students. His apartment was cozy, even at its elevation of nearly 8,000 feet during one of Ethiopia's 2 rainy seasons, because of heaters driven by the small wind turbines on the roof of his 10-unit building. He went to his patio and collected the 4 liters of water his electricity-powered condenser had pulled out of the air during the day, a feat even easier than normal given the current high humidity, and made himself and his wife some thick black coffee. He relies on the town's water system for use in his toilet and shower, but for safety's sake, he uses the pure water from the condenser for drinking, cooking, and brushing his teeth. After all, the condenser only costs him pennies a day, and the economy in the capital is thriving. While his 2 teenage children did their homework, Tesfaye plugged in his computer and connected to the internet via a low-Earth satellite. He decided to have his students read Cutting for Stone by Abraham Verghese, both because Tesfaye loved the book and because he wanted to raise his students' sights. Verghese had been born just down the road in Addis Ababa before earning a medical degree in India, working his way to a professorship at Stanford University, and then becoming an acclaimed novelist, so the book seemed fitting for the students. While Cutting for Stone, which was written in English, had long since been translated into Amharic, Tesfaye had been searching for material on Verghese in any and every language, and was using Google Translate to produce a version in Amharic of Verghese's story to share with his students. Thinking about Verghese's journey, which began when his family fled Ethiopia after Marxists staged a coup during the civil war that began in the mid-1970s, Tesfaye reflected on how he, too, had already made quite a journey, without having to go anywhere. He'd grown up in the 2010s and 2020s, at a time when his town had no electricity, like half the population in Africa at the time, and got its water from a well. While he was still quite young, his father had become sick and died, and while his mother did whatever odd jobs she could, there wasn't much work to be had. Tesfaye, his mother, and his sister mostly lived on a modest amount of money funneled through an international relief agency. A 50-pound bag of rice was a big Christmas gift. But Tesfaye persevered with his education through high school, and then the world began changing around him. As part of an economic development program in a country that was the second most populous in Africa and that had already begun modernizing, a wind turbine had been installed on the edge of his town in the early 2020s, and the government provided microloans for people who bought electric appliances. While the service wasn't reliable, it produced so much electricity that people could do some types of work more efficiently and thus produce more. Before too long, some of the more successful entrepreneurs bought hot plates and mostly stopped burning wood to cook. The smoke that often hung over the town in the dry seasons diminished, and chronic illnesses declined. The creeping improvements in prosperity fed on itself, and, before too many years passed, the town was wired for electricity. It then set up a small solar farm and installed some inexpensive batteries, drawing on low-interest loans from the government to augment the wind turbine. The town began investing in services, including water and even education, the latter of which took a giant leap once the school bought a couple of tablet computers that connected to a satellite. Students suddenly had access to all the world's information. The microgrid was quite reliable. The combination of wind at such altitude, on the edge of the Great Rift Valley, and sunshine just north of the equator meant that power generation rarely lapsed for long. And electricity became almost totally reliable when a trunk line connected the town to a small thorium reactor that was set up to serve the far western suburbs of Addis Ababa. Africa had added 950 million people between 2020 and 2050, half the growth in world population during that period. And Ethiopia had been a leader in the new form of electrification, starting with microgrids and building up to a more national system rather than starting from the top down, building a massive grid and seeing how far out it could reach. Pulling back from his reverie, Tesfaye moved on from his research on Verghese and began a new project, looking for videos from Addis Ababa. He and his mother had never been to the capital, even though it was only 20 miles away. But a spur of the highway had finally reached their town, and autonomous buses now passed near them several times a day. He'd decided to surprise her with a trip to celebrate her 70th birthday, an age that would have sounded absurd to her when he was a child. So few even lived into their 50s in their small town. The more Tesfaye searched, the more he realized how much Addis Ababa differed from the stories he'd heard his whole life. He'd grown up hearing that people piled, standing room only, into blue donkeys, minibus taxis, that traveled with their doors open to make it easier for people to jump on and off at corners, that the streets were full of beggars, that whole sections of the city could be a foot underwater during a hard rain. But all the videos Tesfaye saw showed him a city that looked more like New York than like the one in the stories he'd heard. He said to himself. Maybe the whole country has changed.